This is a Honda Nighthawk 650. It's a universal Japanese motorcycle, just like all the other four cylinders of the 70s and 80s. And I can never get this thing to run right. At the start of every summer, I get excited about riding this thing. I pull it out of storage, and then I proceed to spend the entire summer wrenching on it before I finally put it away for winter again. I probably only end up riding this thing once or twice a year because it's just always broken. This summer is different though. My partner just got a Honda Rebel, and I don't want to be stuck in the garage wrenching on mine all summer while she's out riding hers. This summer, I need to actually get this thing running because I finally have someone else to ride with, and this 40-year-old motorcycle is the only bike I own right now. Something about inline fours just hits different for me. This thing doesn't even wake up until around 7,000 RPMs, and then it sings all the way above and beyond 12,000 RPMs. The power is smooth and it's linear, and it pulls twice as long as a comparable V-twin. It doesn't really matter to me that this thing is 40 years old and only makes about 50 horsepower. I've owned a bike with double that power, and I prefer riding this one. Riding a slow bike fast is much more fun than riding a fast bike slow, and it's safer. Don't get me wrong, 100 horsepower on a motorcycle can be a lot of fun on the freeway. Personally, I much prefer riding a twisty canyon road anyways, and that's really where a bike like this performs well. Horsepower be damned. The problem though, is that 4 cylinders means 4 carburetors. I'm a millennial, so I can barely figure out 1 carburetor, much less 4. My biggest issue is that they just don't make parts for these carbs anymore. There's all these little fuel and air lines that connect these 4 carburetors in the stack, and they're made out of plastic, and they get brittle, and they inevitably end up breaking. And then when they break, I cannot find new ones. I've tried machining my own, I've tried 3D printing my own, and it never works quite right. I've given up on them. 4 carbs is too damn many, I can't find parts for these. I'm gonna go a different route. There are kits online to convert these motorcycles over to running generic Mikuni carbs, and it combines 2 of the cylinders on each so that you only run 2 carbs total. I'm gonna give one of these kits a try. These kits are supposed to be a performance upgrade, but I don't really care that much about that. What I do care about is getting a carb on this thing that I can actually find parts for. I got the kit on and it was fitting okay, except that my air filter ran into my battery box. This could be my fault because a few years ago I modified the battery box. This thing spends so much time cranking that I thought a bigger battery would be a really good upgrade, but that may have meant that the battery box is just a little too big for the air filters now. Either way, this fits close enough that it can be a temporary permanent solution. As is expected for this bike, while it was apart, I found a bunch of other stuff wrong with it. First off, I found a new package of coils and wires sitting in my parts bin that was brand new. I figured past me probably knew something that present me has forgotten and that there was a reason I bought these, so I figured I'd better throw them on. I don't think it needed new plugs because I found a bunch of empty plug boxes in there, so just coils and wires for now. After that, the next major fix this thing needed was the brake lever. This one was my fault. My new garage is about half the size of my old one, and I can't really fit 2 projects here in the same time. So what happened was I was backing my Explorer out of the garage and I caught the brake lever on the bike and snapped it clean off. So lesson learned, I'm not even gonna try and fit my motorcycle in the garage at the same time as the Explorer. 1 project at a time in the garage for me now. My motorcycle might actually be safer outside. There's a silver lining though. I see this as an opportunity for a forced upgrade. I ended up putting on some fancy generic aftermarket upgrade. Once again, parts for this bike are hard to find, so universal parts are great. I'm sure this bike's brakes were good for 1982, but they're really not that good for 2024. Hopefully a more modern brake helps a little. While I was up here, I had to run the throttle cables for the new carburetors, and unfortunately, every time you take old plastic apart and then try and put it back together, it never goes back the same. This throttle is no longer clamping the bar as hard as it ought to, and if you pull the throttle too hard now, it'll just rotate the grip. It doesn't seem like there's any way this is gonna make the throttle stick, and it only seems to happen if you're trying to make it happen, so seems like a problem for future me. I'm gonna leave it like this for now. Next, in typical fashion for this bike, I went to put the fuel tank back on and I discovered it was leaking. I ordered a new petcock, but unfortunately the website, which said the petcock was for a 1982 Honda CB650SC, was wrong and it wasn't. I ended up ordering a second universal one, and the universal one worked where the bike specific one didn't, so I thought that was interesting. So I fixed the fuel leak, put the fuel system back together, went to crank the bike, and it didn't crank. Again, in typical fashion for this bike. Now, I already dedicated an entire video to fixing a cranking issue on this bike. Last time I fixed the starter clutch, This time it's not a starter clutch issue. The starter won't even spin, even when I jump it with a jump pack. So this is a different issue. I took the starter apart and the only thing that I could tell was wrong was that the spring on the brushes didn't seem to be pushing the brushes very hard. I don't know if I've been through the starter before and I just assembled it wrong, but either way, this thing got new springs. The brushes looked okay. Are you starting to see why I can never get this thing running? It just sits so long that things degrade and stop working. If you want stuff to run, sitting is really bad for them. The longer things sit, the more seals dry out and fail, the more plastics get brittle, the more metals corrode together. Sitting is really bad for things. If you want things to run, drive them. Don't let things sit. I finally got it to crank, and it even started, but it's running like crap. I can't rev it without it dying or misfiring, and it sounds like it's only running on 2 cylinders. An inline 4 should not have a choppy sound like this. It should be smooth. And then I checked the exhaust with a thermometer, and it seemed like the inside 2 cylinders weren't firing and the outside 2 were. Since one of the dead cylinders is on each carb, to me that indicates it's not a problem with the new carburetors, it's a problem with the ignition system. On top of that, the alternator isn't charging. That's unfortunate because it wasn't that long ago I went through the entire alternator and replaced the stator and freshened things up, but I pulled it apart again, and this time it was a rotor issue, which was the part I did not replace last time. It looks like the wire for the rotor is either melted or just broken and missing. Either way, it's no longer connected. I replaced the rotor and now it was charging, but not very well. It was only picking up about 1/2 volt. I looked a little closer and there was a smashed wire that goes to the regulator. This one probably wasn't the bike's fault. I probably smashed that when I was putting the cover back on. That's my bad. I soldered the wire back together, and while I was at it, I figured the only remaining part of the charging system that wasn't new was the regulator, so I ought to replace the regulator. As expected though, the part that said it fit this bike did not fit this bike. The connector wasn't the right connector. What I ended up doing was just adding a nice fancy Deutsch style connector that I had left over from my Explorer's electronic dash build. These are pretty nice connectors, so I'm just gonna call out another forced upgrade. After all that work, it's finally charging about as you'd expect for these bikes, which is not very good. These things are notorious for not having enough alternator. Allegedly, they don't even charge at idle from the factory, which means you actually have to rev them to make sure your battery doesn't die, and then you have to put them on a trickle charger when you get home just to be safe. Since I know these alternators weren't very good to begin with, and half my cylinders are still misfiring, I'm just gonna assume that's alternator fixed. There's not much more I could replace anyways. It's still crap, but it's better than it was. Now I need to move on to fixing the misfire. The inside 2 cylinders are the ones that are missing, and they share a coil, so I figured there was something wrong with the coil or wires on the inside. Now I already replaced this coil once this video, so I didn't expect this, but when I went to take the wires apart, it looked like they didn't really have a very good connection. It just seems like this is a really cheap coil wire setup and the wires don't connect very well. I was hoping I could just order new wires, but I couldn't find the right boot for this motorcycle, so I just ended up ordering a whole new kit. And it's probably a good thing I did, because when it got here, I realized it was way nicer than the other one I had. I wish I had just kept the stock ones and not thrown them away, because then I could have at least swapped wires around to troubleshoot, but I didn't. And that's why you never throw anything away. I replaced both the coils and all the wires again, and I got it started. It misfired a bunch when I first started it, but I had also been running it without the inside 2 cylinders firing, so I'm assuming there was just a bunch of unburnt fuel in there. After a few seconds, it's running on 4 cylinders again. It also seems like it's charging a lot better now too. Now my multimeter says 12.9 volts here, and you would want 13.6 or so, but remember it started at around 12 volts. It was already low before I started the bike, so picking up a full volt is about what I would expect. It looks like it's alternator and misfire fixed. Do you remember how at the beginning I said this thing revs to 12K? I wasn't overselling it. If anything, I was probably underselling it. This bike might be the vehicle that's the biggest pain in the butt that I own, but maybe I just have a little Stockholm syndrome because hearing this thing rev reminded me of how much I really love this thing. All right, it's finally time for my partner and I to go on our first motorcycle ride together since college, which was almost a decade ago. I'm crossing my fingers that we finally both happen to have a running motorcycle at the same time as each other. But let's find out. Now, I'm not gonna say this thing is perfect. First of all, it's leaking quite a bit of oil out of the first cylinder, which makes it pretty smoky. The brakes also don't feel anything like a modern bike, and I'm not even sure what I would do to upgrade those because they're good enough to lock up the tires, but the tires just don't seem to have that much traction, even though they're relatively new. Perhaps it's a suspension issue and I'm just not getting the weight transfer I need for the front brake to work right. On top of that, I live at 8,000 feet and the carbs definitely need tuned for that. At higher RPMs, I still am getting a bit of a misfire every now and then. And the alternator is working, but if I start it multiple times without driving 10 miles or so in between, it does need to be bump started. It's been a few weeks now and I've been riding this thing as much as I can. All things considered, this is the best state that this bike has been in years. It's good enough to ride on the weekends with my partner. It's good enough to go on solo errands alone and not be paranoid it's gonna break down the whole time. This is a huge improvement. Overall, I think this is a huge success, but projects are never finished and there's a lot more work to be done on this bike. I even bought a new mount for my GoPro so that you can have some better footage next time. So subscribe and stick around. Thanks for hanging out with me on my motorcycle today. Now, get out there and build something. I hope to see you next time.